Well, good evening, everyone. Can you all hear me up the top there? Yeah? And welcome to Oxford Town Hall. My name's Rob Gifford. I'm an editor at The Economist magazine. And welcome to our evening asking the question, can science explain everything? A new book written by Professor John Lennox. Before I introduce him, could I just say that we'll be talking for about 45 minutes together, just in conversation, and then after that we'll have about 45 minutes of question and answer. So if you have a question to put to Dr. Lennox, you can do that. We're not doing it with microphones, we're doing it, you can do it on your phone through Pigeonhole. Go in your browser to pigeonhole.at, Alpha Tango, and put in John Lennox, all one word with capitals. John Lennox is the passcode for that. You can start putting those questions in, and then when we get to the time of Q&A in about 45 minutes, those questions will come through to me, and I will then put them through to Dr. Lennox. At the end of the evening, there will be a book signing as well, where you can purchase the book, and Dr. Lennox will sign it for you. So let's move on to introductions. Professor John Lennox is the Professor of Mathematics, Emeritus, at the University of Oxford, and Emeritus Fellow in Mathematics and the Philosophy of Science at Green Templeton College. He's also an Associate Fellow of the Said Business School and an Adjunct Lecturer at the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics. John, very warm welcome to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming this evening.
Well, it's good of you to come all this way to talk to us about Brexit. Oh, no, that's... Sorry, wrong evening. Let's just jump straight in, then, to know a little bit about you. I think people know you're a scientist, you're a mathematician, but can you just give us a bit of background? The author of this book that we're going to hear about, where did you come from, geographically, where did you grow up, where were you educated? Just give us a little snapshot of your biography.
Well, that's a dangerous question, really, as you'll have detected from my accent. I come originally from Northern Ireland, and my parents were very unusual people because Northern Ireland has a very sad reputation, partly justified, for being sectarian, and we knew violence even in our own family as I was growing up. But my parents were remarkable in the sense that, although they were convinced Christians, they gave me space to think for myself, for which I am so grateful. And secondly, they had a view that all men and women, no matter what they believed, no matter what their worldview was, have equal value. And that showed itself in the fact that in the little family business my father ran, he employed, as far as he could, equally across the religious divide. And that cost him bombings. But it had the effect of instilling in my mind the sheer importance, as I met with other people, to regard them as of infinite value, as people made in the image of God, whether they agreed with me or not. So that was a hugely important foundation.
And you were a great reader as a child, and you got into Cambridge University. You come from a religious family, a Christian family. What's that like, being a person of religious faith, going up to one of the great universities? How are you treated? This is the 1960s, right?
It is the 1960s, at least it's not the 1860s, although I feel like that sometimes. No, it was absolutely amazing because, interestingly enough, so many people think that Christianity closes people's minds down. That would never have occurred to me because for my parents it was the impulse to read as widely as possible. And I'd read a great deal of stuff before I came up to Cambridge. And so I entered into it with immense pleasure, some trepidation, of course. But I found it the kind of milieu that I knew I was going to enjoy. And that's why I'm well, still in a similar university many years later.
But you arrive as a person of faith and as a scientist also. How do people treat you? From those early, we're going to talk about this later, faith and science, what's it like as a young undergraduate with your professors and with your peers?
Well, the interesting thing is, I arrived as a person of faith, but that doesn't explain anything. Faith in God. But simultaneously, I had faith in the scientific method. And one of the confusions and misunderstandings these days is that faith is a kind of religious word, which means believing where there's no evidence. But it isn't. It's an ordinary word, which means trust, comes from the Latin fides. And I was very aware when I went up that scientists needed a fundamental belief, for example, in the rational intelligibility of the universe to do science. I also believed in God, and the second belief justified the first one. So they belong together. And generally speaking, there were exceptions, of course, because inevitably coming from where I did, I felt the full force of Freud. And I'll not forget in a hurry, a student one evening at dinner asked me, did I believe in God? And then he hesitated and he said, you know, I'm really sorry. I said, for what? He said, I should never have asked you that question. You're an Irishman, and all you Irish believe in God and you fight about it. So that's the kind of you believe because you're Irish is the Freudian objection, and I met it many times since.
Let's, as we jump into talking about the book and the broader themes about science and faith, let's just get some definitions straight, shall we?
Yes.
Science itself has changed as a word and as an and as a concept over the centuries. What do you mean when you say science?
Well, it has indeed. As you look at this title, if we were having this evening interview 200 years ago, my answer to the question, can science explain everything, is of course it can. Because science originally, the word comes from the Latin scientia, which simply means knowledge. And explanation, by definition, means to give a rational account of, and therefore gain knowledge. And so in the early meaning of the word science, which incidentally is still preserved in most continental languages, German, for example, Wissenschaft, covers the humanities and the natural sciences. So the first thing to be aware of is, originally, the answer to the question is very simple. By definition, science explains everything because it is rational. But of course, with time, in English, as opposed to many continental languages, science now means the natural sciences. And the big question these days is the idea, which is common in academia, that science in the second meaning, the natural sciences, are the only way to truth. And philosophically, we call that scientism.
Right. But you said in your previous answer, you believe that faith, and indeed you believe this as a young man, that faith and science belong together. Now, I think there's going to be a lot of people in the audience this evening, and of course, we've had a long decade since the publication of Professor Dawkins' book and many others who simply don't accept that fact because they say these are two different things.
Well, I understand that, and I meet it a lot, although I think it's going down a little bit, in the sense that people are, particularly students, are beginning to think through the nature of explanation and beginning to realize that there are different kinds of explanation. But to take your initial point head on, this idea that there's a conflict between science on the one hand and God on the other hand cannot be true. Why? Because if you go to the very top of science, Nobel Prize level, and let's take physics. If you take someone like Higgs, who won the Nobel Prize wonderfully for his prediction of the existence of the Higgs boson, brilliant physicist and an atheist. But William Phillips is a low-temperature physicist who won the same Nobel Prize for physics, and he's a Christian. Now, you see, it's quite obvious that what divides these people is not their scientific prowess. They're both geniuses. What divides them is their worldview. And a lot of confusion in thinking about this, in my view, is that we don't realize where the conflict really lies. There is a conflict, but it's not between science and God. It's between theism and atheism, two worldviews. And there are scientists on both sides. And that's why for many years the question for me has been, where does science sit in all this? Is it neutral? Does it point towards God? Or does it point towards atheism? But generally speaking, philosophers of science, historians of science, they regard this idea that there's an essential conflict, they regard it as a myth, in fact.
But the idea that science is evidence-based and faith is not. This is at the center of what the debate is, the lack of evidence.
Yes, well, we must talk about evidence, and I'm a pure mathematician. And many people say, can you prove all this stuff to me? And I say, in what sense do you mean proof? Because if you mean proof in the rigorous mathematical sense, that only works within mathematics, full stop. It doesn't work in physics, chemistry, or anywhere else. In all the other disciplines, when we use the word proof, we mean it in the sense in which lawyers mean it, the forensic sense. Give me evidence, pointers, indicators that are beyond reasonable doubt. Now, often people think, but isn't that weak? No, it isn't weak. I mean, if I fly abroad, I trust the aircraft to get me there. I can't prove to you mathematically it will get me there, but I risk my life on it. And at the personal level, because trust and faith is not only in propositions, but it's also in people. I've been married to the same woman for 50 years. I believe she loves me. I couldn't prove it to you mathematically, but I'd risk my life on it. So we're all aware of this. Now, evidence is a hugely important thing. And we need to clear up a total misunderstanding. And that is that, say, my Christian faith is not evidence-based. Faith is believing where you know there's no evidence. That is utter nonsense. You see, faith, let's take science first. Why do I believe Newton's laws? Because I believe there's strong evidence for them. Why do I believe my wife loves me? Because I believe there's strong evidence for it. And all of us are familiar with evidence-based faith. In fact, to the extent that you're crazy if you believe things without evidence or trust people without evidence. As we're discovering on the internet, up comes a message that we don't quite recognize, and we open it, and before we know, we've lost several £1,000s. We now are aware that we shouldn't trust these things unless we've got evidence. Now, to come to your specific question, I believe that science is evidence-based, but there are different kinds of evidence. What I mean by that is this. In school and in university, we are used to the primary way of thinking about science, which is induction. We do an experiment, we repeat it. And the essence of it is repeatability, reproducibility. But there's another aspect to science. Cosmology, for example, you cannot repeat the beginning of the universe to see what actually happened. So what you have to do is act more like a historian and make an inference to the best explanation. That still is under the aegis of science. But incidentally, it begins to answer this question. Can the natural sciences explain everything? Absolutely not. They cannot deal with history. for a start, and there are many other things that I will mention. So that's on the science side, and we're used to that kind of evidence, either direct, reproducible experiments, although that has problems, as David Hume pointed out, and the question of inference to the best explanation of unrepeatable events in the past or even in the present. But when it comes to my Christian faith, I adopt exactly the same criteria. Why do I believe it? Because I believe there's powerful evidence. And the interesting thing is this: if you ask, and it's always sensible to listen to what people say if you want to know what they believe, if you ask the basic document of the Christian faith what it means by faith, it will tell you directly. And let me give you a quotation of the purpose of the Gospel of John, the fourth Gospel. It says this: "Many other signs Jesus did in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life in his name." In other words, John is saying, these things that I've collected and written down, they are to form the basis of belief. That is their evidence. Now, of course, you want to know at what level their evidence, and we could go all night talking about that. But the crucial thing to perceive is, when Christianity was launched on the world, it was launched on the world by people from a very unexpected background, a Jewish background, who started to say that they had evidence of meeting Jesus Christ risen from the dead. So my Christian faith is based on evidence. My scientific faith is equally based on evidence. And since both are rational disciplines, that it's so important to get rid of the idea, very common in scientism, that natural science and rationality are coextensive. They certainly are not.
You brought in the Bible right there then. We're talking about, when you're talking about evidence, that your faith is based on evidence, you're talking about evidence in the Bible, in historical documents you believe to be historical documents, that a man lived and died and rose again according to eyewitnesses who wrote them.
Yes, I do indeed. And one of the interesting things is, I wish I'd been taught history properly, because it is such an important rational discipline. Peace be to those of a scientific view. And it was quite a revelation to me some years ago to discover the depth of agreement between ancient historians about the authenticity of the New Testament documents, about the existence of Christ, and about the various things that he did. And I'm talking about historians, atheist historians, skeptical historians, Christian historians. The depth of agreement is such that I wish there was more publicity about it, because there is a lot of evidence for that kind of authenticity.
And what about the big questions about the authenticity of Christian scripture?
Well, that's what I'm talking about, because where the historians get most, but not all of the evidence, is from Christian scripture. And I don't have the figures all in my head, but scripture, the New Testament, is attested by far more manuscript than any other documents from similar age that are accepted without question by scholars. Now, this is something, I'm simply asserting that. If you want to know about it, then you want to do some reading, but there's plenty of stuff out there. And then, of course, there's the testimony of Josephus, Serapion, and a number of other contemporary ancient historians. So that the basic things, even the resurrection appearances of Christ. There's a Jewish scholar, so he's not a Christian, who says that the only rational explanation, I'm not quoting him accurately, he says that the only real explanation of the documents is that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. It's a most intriguing thing.
So why are more scientists not Christians then? We were talking earlier about Stephen Hawking, great example. He says he doesn't need a God to explain the universe.
Did you say why are more scientists not Christian?
Right.
Well, do you know how many are Christian? If you go through the Oxford University heads of scientific departments, you'd be surprised how many are. And in fact, if you take the Nobel Prizes between 1900 and 2000, that's 100 years of Nobel Prizes, 65% of people, I understand, were believers in God. It's not so small as you think, but you raised Stephen Hawking, and that's interesting because the impression is given by very powerful voices, and Stephen had a very powerful voice, and he was an absolutely brilliant physicist. I remember him at Cambridge. He was just ahead of me, and in time, but he's light years ahead of me in brain power. He's an absolutely brilliant physicist. And it's sad, to my mind, that he didn't live to see Hawking radiation discovered when he would have got the Nobel Prize. That to my mind, is a pity. But
you're not questioning his science, though, of course.
Absolutely not. I'm in awe of his science. I've even tried to read some of it, you know. But the point you were making was about Hawking?
In fact, probably to do with the definition of God, I think. Coming back to, in the book, you talk about how Hawking defines God and how you define God is different.
Yes. It really intrigued me, you see, because Hawking had the Lucasian chair at Cambridge, which Newton had. And Newton discovered gravity, and Newton was a believer in God. And he used gravity as one of the reasons. What an amazing God who did this, and put it in the most famous book in the history of science, Principia Mathematica. And Hawking studied gravity, black holes, black hole radiation, and so on. And yet he used gravity as a reason not to believe in God. Now, if you're Irish like I am, and you come up against that kind of a conundrum, you want to dig in and find out, how is it? Is it just that history has gone by and we've grown up to realize that God isn't necessary, which is a very important way of putting it these days, because that's what Hawking said, you don't need God. Or is it something else? And I came to the conclusion it was very much something else. Two things mainly. First of all, and you referred to it, Hawking's concept of God. You see, I'm very old, as you see. And in my youth, when I used the word God, everybody understood it. Of course, they were all Irish. They knew who God was. God was the eternal creator and sustainer of the universe. But you see, there's been a huge shift. And I've got to be so careful when I use the word God, because I'll be misunderstood. And it's clear from Hawking's book, The Grand Design, which he co-authored with Leonard Nodinoff, that he thinks of God as a kind of Greek God. Now that makes a vast difference. Why? Because your Greek god of lightning was what we now call a god of the gaps. I can't explain lightning, so I postulate a god to explain lightning. And then when I study atmospheric physics at Oxford, year 1, lecture 1, that god disappears. A god of the gaps. Now, this is very important. Hawking believed that I believed in a god of the gaps. Now, that explains why there was such pressure from him and others for people to choose between science and God. Now, this is so important, this point. Why would we have to choose? Well, think about it. If you believe that God is a god of the gaps, I can't explain it, therefore God did it, then you have to choose between God and science. Why? Because that's how you've defined God. You've defined God as the unknown explanation for what science has not yet explained. But you see, the God of the Bible is not a God of the gaps. Have you ever read the first few words of Genesis? I hope some of you might have. In the beginning, God created the bits of the universe we don't yet understand. No. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, the whole show. The bits we do understand, the bits we don't understand. So you see, Newton never felt that tension, science or God, because his God was the God of the whole show. What is more, it was the bits he did understand that moved him to say, look, in Principia Mathematica, he put in the foreword, I hope this will persuade thinking people to believe in the existence of a deity. It was the bits he did understand that moved him towards God. And that's precisely my position. It's not ignorance, the things I don't understand. It's the things I do. So that's the first point. Now, there is a second one, but I don't know whether you want me to address it.
Go for it, quickly. Yeah.
Well, it's his actual explanation, Hawking's, of why he doesn't need God. And this is the science bit, you see. And the key argument in the grand design is this statement: because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. And when I saw that at first, I thought, just a minute. Because there's a law of gravity, because there is something, the universe will create itself from nothing. That's a flat contradiction. Then it got worse as I examined it even further. Because there's a law of gravity. He doesn't say because gravity exists, which maybe he meant. But this idea that, well, what would a law of gravity mean if you didn't have a universe in which there was gravitational attraction? But it opens up the possibility, which I see in other scientists, of the idea that laws create the universe. I once had a little conversation with Peter Atkins at this university, and I asked him, what do you think created the universe? He said, mathematics. And I'm afraid I laughed, which wasn't the right thing to do. And I said, sorry, Peter, but really that's the craziest thing I've ever heard. He said, why? Well, I said, look, 1 + 1 = 2. Did that ever put 2 pounds in your pocket? The point is, laws, Newton's laws of motion, never moved a billiard ball in the history of the universe. People would accuse you that. The laws describe the regularities. They do not create the universe. And therefore it amazes me when a physicist of the level of Paul Davies, who I know, says, I like to think, I don't like the idea of a God who tinkers. I like the notion of some very clever mathematical law creating the universe. But that doesn't even begin to make sense. So what worried me was, here is brilliant Stephen Hawking, moving, this isn't science that he writes. This is his own belief. It doesn't even make sense, and that concerned me. Is this the length to which you have to go to get rid of God?
So, if we're looking at some definitions, you've defined science and you've defined God as you see it. Another interesting area you go into in the book is the different levels of the word explain. So you talk about how there are different types of explanation.
I do, because I think it's extremely important. You see, often the conversation comes to an end. There's no God. Why, we have a law that explains. But you need to investigate that. What do you mean by explanations? For example, what does the law of gravity explain? I wasn't very well taught at some of the schools I was at. And I used to think the law of gravity explained gravity. But it doesn't. Newton said so. Hypothesi non fingo, he wrote. I don't make any hypothesis. I don't pretend to know what gravity is. The law of gravity gives you a wonderful mathematical way of calculating the effects of attraction between massive bodies. It doesn't tell you what gravity is. In fact, no one knows, even today, what gravity really is. So, point number one, within science itself, to say a law explains usually only means it explains at a certain level. Point number two, different kinds of explanation. Why is the water boiling? Well, because the heat is being conducted through the base of the kettle, and that's agitating the molecules of water. That's why it's boiling. Okay, but actually it's boiling because I love a cup of tea. Now, you laugh because you see instantly that those are two different kinds of explanation. The first one is the scientific one, but it doesn't conflict with or contradict the second one, which is a personal agent explanation. Now, if we just extrapolate from that simple thought, it gives us an idea, and it's this. The God explanation, as the originator and sustainer of the universe, no more competes with science than postulating Henry Ford and saying that he conflicts with automobile engineering and physics as an explanation for the motor car. In most things in life, there are multiple explanations that complement one another. And the irony is, I suppose, about the boiling water, people have been drinking tea and enjoying it for thousands of years before they knew anything about heat equations. The personal explanation is normally more important than the scientific explanation. And that is immensely important as we look at things. So I find it very difficult to understand scientism, that science is the only way to truth, since there are these various levels of explanation. And one little final point, Rob, if I may. There's a logical problem here. The statement, science is the only way to truth, contradicts itself, because that statement is not a statement of science. And so therefore, if it's true, it's false. Maybe it's too late at night for that kind of thing.
A bit too early, maybe. I want to come back to the foundation of your faith, because you say you're a believer in the God of the Bible, but that means that you are, I take it, a believer in miracles. Miracles, you will recall David Hume in the 18th century saying, are a violation of the laws of nature. How on earth are you squaring those two things?
Well, it's not how on earth, it's how in heaven, but I'll come to that in a moment. David Hume's objection is the one that comes up all the time. And if you care to watch my debate with Christopher Hitchens some years ago, he pushed that very hard with me. But Hume is a very interesting case. And years ago, I started to read the dialogues of religion that he wrote. And I began to be a bit uncertain of the accuracy of what he wrote. And later in life, just a few years ago, I had the privilege of having an interview with the late Anthony Flew, brilliant philosopher at Reading University, and the Richard Dawkins of his day, and the world expert on the works of David Hume. And I asked him about this, the miracles being a violation of the laws of nature. And you know, it was one of the most honest statements I've ever heard from a leading thinker. He said, I was wrong about Hume. I said, seriously? Yes, he said, I was wrong. I would need to write all my books again, but I'll never get to it. That is an amazing thing for a person to say. Now, what is the problem? The problems are many with Hume. He talked about miracles being violations of the laws of nature, but actually he didn't believe in cause and effect. So for him, formulating a law of nature would have been very difficult. But leaving that aside, the problem lies in the word violate and in the nature of law. You see, laws of nature are not like the laws of a country. How can I put it? I think it was C.S. Lewis, and I'm old enough to have listened to Lewis, so you can judge how old I am from that. Lewis is still, I think, one of the best thinkers dealing with this question, and he talked about Hume many years ago in a book entitled Miracles. And he said, to illustrate this, let's imagine I'm staying in a hotel in Oxford tonight, and I put £100 in the drawer, and then I put another 100 tomorrow night. So that's 200. And I wake up on the third morning and there are 50 pounds in my drawer. What do I conclude? That the laws of arithmetic have been broken or the laws of England? Now think about it, because obviously the laws of England have been broken, but how do I know that? Because I know the laws of arithmetic have not been broken. My mistake was to think of the drawer and my room being a closed system of cause and effect. But it isn't. Somebody, a thief, could put their hand in and take the 150 pounds out. And Lewis makes this point. You see, the laws are not constraints. They don't forbid it. They just describe what normally happens. They do not tell you whether someone can intervene or not. Now, it's very important to realize that. You see, one of the stories in the accounts in the New Testament Gospels is that the early disciples, the women, first of all, were able to get into the tomb of Jesus because an angel had rolled away the stone. Now, analyze that from a scientific point of view. A stone, a heavy stone, to move it needs a force. And Newton's law will tell you that the force F is equal to the mass times the acceleration. So that law would have described the motion of that stone. It obeyed the laws of nature. What the laws of nature can't tell you is anything about the existence of angels who can push a stone. See, the point is, the laws are inadequate in every situation because laws need to be supported by initial conditions and boundary conditions. The laws don't tell you what those are. Of course, we have to discuss the existence of angels on different grounds, but the point I'm saying to you is that initial, it was a supernatural shove, of course, but once it was inputted, the laws of nature took over, and the stone rolled, and you could have worked it out by Newton's law. So, what I'm concluding is that miracles don't violate the laws of nature. God upholds, he sustains the universe, and he's built regularities into it. And here's the irony of the whole thing. Unless you know the laws, you'll never recognize a miracle. If you thought that dead people pop up out of the graves all the time, you'd never see anything special in the resurrection of Jesus. You've got to know the regularities in order to recognize the input of something from outside.
I'm sure some of you will want to come back to Professor Lennox. I nearly said Professor Lewis there. Professor Lennox standing on the shoulders of giants. On this, remember, pigeonhole.at will be taking some questions about 10 minutes. Do send them through. John, we have to come to history, brutal history. There have been some crazy religious people. There's been some pretty unpleasant Christian history. How do you approach that when you're trying to tell people that there is a God of love?
Difficult for an Irishman. But I have to face it head on. And it usually comes in that form with me. How could you possibly maintain a Christian faith when you watch what's happened in your own country? Well, that's the first level at which I met it. So let me start there very briefly. The first thing to say about what's happened in my home country is that I am utterly ashamed of it. I'm utterly ashamed that the name of Christ has ever been associated with bombs and AK-47s. That's point number one. Point number two is, the sad thing is that if you take bombs and guns to defend Christ or his message, you are not Christian. How do I know that? Because Christ forbade the use of weapons to defend him. Put your sword away, he said. And to Pilate, when he was put on trial, and this is hugely important historically, Pilate said, are you competing with me? Are you a king then? Well, not in the sense you mean, he said to Pilate. My kingdom is not of this world. Otherwise, my servants would have been fighting. But they weren't fighting. Because anybody that takes weapons in the name of Christianity is, I say it straight, is not Christian. They're disobeying Christ. Now, there's another thing to be said. How could Christ have encouraged violence and war when the message he was preaching was a message of forgiveness, love, salvation, peace with God, harmony? It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So I would want to stand back from that and be absolutely straight. Not all that glitters is gold. And the sad thing is there have been professing Christians throughout history who have brought utter disgrace on the name of Christ by going against what he said. So what is very important, therefore, and it's sometimes difficult to get underneath all this overlay, especially if you've suffered it personally, to begin to get underneath and see what the true message of Christianity is. Now, you're opening up a huge question, and people may want to talk about it later, because your question has an edge to it for me, and it's the hardest thing I face. Take suffering of any kind, just not Northern Ireland. How do you square the existence of God with that?
I was going to ask. I mean, we are having, because of time constraints, the top 10 complaints about religious faith, but the elephant in the room is always suffering.
Yes, it is.
How children with cancer, earthquakes.
Yes.
How can you square any of that?
Well, you can square it by saying there isn't a God. And many people have taken that. You know, yesterday was Sunday, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And it was Holocaust Memorial Day. And as I was sitting thinking, I remembered the many visits I've made to Auschwitz. And I always came out of Auschwitz weeping. Just the sheer horror of it all. And that's moral evil. And then you've added to that the problem of pain, cancers, all this kind of thing. And shall I try giving the short answer? And then people can raise this if you want to. So I'm not trying to cheat, because this is the hardest question anybody faces, no matter what their worldview is. But the way I begin to face it is, and I've sat with so many people that say, I cannot believe in God because of this or that or the other thing. And I say, okay, then there is no God. Tell me. Now, if they're thinking people, I will then ask them, where does your concept of evil come from, by which you're judging this stuff as evil? Now, philosophically, I think Dostoevsky had it right when he said, if there is no God, then everything is permitted. He wasn't suggesting that atheists couldn't behave. Of course they can. They can put Christians to shame. But he was saying there's no rational reason to believe in the concepts of good and evil if there's no God. Richard Dawkins has said that to this generation. He said, look, the universe is just exactly as you would expect it to be. If at bottom there is no good, no evil, no justice, DNA just is, and we dance to its music. That's the end of all morality, and it's the end of all capacity to judge the evil. So you can try and get out of it by denying there's God, and you've got a kind of solution. You've got rid of the problem at the expense of getting rid of God, and also at the expense of getting rid of all hope. Because if there is no God, there is no hope. So I want to explore a different way of doing this. And, you know, we argue all the time. You've done it, undergraduates, to the middle of the night. I did it endlessly. Surely a good God would, could, might, and you know the kind of arguments, and they never got anywhere in my experience. Why? Well, as a mathematician, I suggest they never got anywhere because we were asking the wrong question. There is another question you can ask. The big problem, ladies and gentlemen, and it's really miles away from this topic, but that doesn't matter, it gets asked. The big problem is we face a world which presents to us a mixed picture. I call it bombs and beauty. Look at the sky tonight, an Andromeda galaxy up there, and look at the pictures of Yemen. Bombs, barbed wire on one side, and beauty. And any worldview worthy of the name has got to be able to come to terms with that. Now, I face that, my skeptical friends face it, my atheist friends face it, all of us face it. And I can only say where I can not give you a simplistic solution. There's no way I could do that. But I think there's a way in. And it's by asking this question, granted this mixed picture, is there any evidence anywhere, evidence note, that there is a God that you could trust with it? Boy, that's a huge question. And it brings me finally to the fact that whatever you make of the crucifixion and revelation and resurrection of Jesus, he claimed to be God. Think just for a moment, if he were God, what's God doing on a cross? And that begins to tell me that God hasn't remained distant from the problem of human suffering, but has himself become part of it. And if that was the end of the story, I wouldn't be telling it to you. But now the resurrection of Jesus comes into its power, because if there is an individual who has conquered death and who offers the same to anyone who trusts him, then that changes the whole picture, because it means that death is not the end. And that opens all sorts of doors of possibility for a God of love to compensate those who suffered unjustly. But that is a huge story. That's only the beginning of it.
Well, that's the beginning. That's a good place to end the first section of this evening. Okay. And I'm sure there will be people wanting to come back to you on that. Just a reminder, it's pigeonhole.at, and you need to type in John Lennox, all one word, in capitals in order to ask a question. So I've got them here on my screen. And I think probably let's begin with one that talks about origins. There are several here about origins. Where's it gone? They're all jumping around. Evolution. People always want to know about evolution. The two top questions here. What do you think about evolution and its contradiction to the Bible? The other top one that people have voted for in the room is on the same subject. How do you reconcile? And the tone also of some of these questions probably needs some clarification, because I think in the general dialogue there is an assumption that if you believe in the Bible, then you are a creationist. The number of these questions talking about how can you believe that the earth is several thousand years old. So could you deal with some of these issues of origins of the earth, origins of man?
Well, it's very interesting that these come up first. And they are very important questions, because all of us actually are interested in our past. That's why the bookshops are full of books on origins, because what you think about your past determines your identity. And so they are important questions. But we need to clear some air. And the first way to clear the air is to be honest with what? Well, I'm not a cosmologist. I read a lot of cosmology. I'm not a biologist. I read a lot of biology. So this is a Q&A, and you ought to realize that the Q&A is a very unsatisfactory process. Why? Because I just hear these questions now, and you get a reaction from the top of my skull. And it's quite a small space, the top of my skull. And I can only react and begin to answer the question. And of course, you're going to be dissatisfied. You're Oxford students, after all, most of you. So you're going to be very dissatisfied. That doesn't matter. Because if I can open a way into your exploration, the most important thing is the work you will do on your question. If it's a real question, I'm not just trying to test how much I know, you'll soon find out how little I know. If it's a real question, the work you do in your own room, reading, searching on the internet, you'll never forget the answers you get. So bear with me, and I'll just say a few things so that we don't occupy the entire time with this, which we could easily. The first thing I think to say is the glaring contradiction which many people feel between cosmology and Genesis is the age of the earth. And when you use the word creationist, you're using it in the contemporary sense, which means a person that believes in a young earth and a young universe. Now, I've got a confession to make here, and it is that my hometown, which was deliberately not mentioned earlier, is Armagh in Northern Ireland. Now, you may never have heard of it, but you may have heard of Archbishop Usher of Armagh, who wrote to the Vice-Chancellor of Cambridge and suggested that Adam was created at roughly 9 o'clock on the 9th of October, 4004 BC, and he was sorry that he couldn't give more accurate information. So I've got a lot to live down. I'm going to give you my answer. Now, the sad thing to my mind is when Christians now, and the rest of you can just close your ears for a minute, this is in-house. When Christians start fighting over these things, it's an absolute tragedy. The fact of creation is infinitely more important than when it happened. But the question on the table, as you put it, is, isn't there a flat contradiction, and so we can forget about Genesis? Well, the answer to that, as I understand it, now people disagree with their interpretation, both of science and of Scripture, but as I look at it, what Genesis says is, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Well, when was that? Well, there's a sequence of days, you may remember, and the days go from 1 up to 6. Creation is finished, and God rests on the seventh day. How are you going to understand that? Well, let's become a literature experts for a moment. And this is fascinating because I'm passionately interested in literature and the way it puts across argument. But in Genesis 1, there's an introductory bit, God created the heavens and earth and so on. It only lasts 2 verses. Then you have the sequence of days, and then God rests. Now, what is interesting about that? Well, the first thing that's interesting, and here I'm indebted to the Hebrew scholars, and I checked with a professor of Hebrew at Oxford, and also I checked with a professor of Hebrew at Cambridge, just in case there might be a difference. And what I was told was that the introductory bit, and God created, is in one Hebrew past tense, and the statement of the days is in another Hebrew past tense. What's the difference between them? Well, Jack Collins, who's both a scientist by training and a brilliant Hebrew scholar, says the difference is this, that the tense for the introduction to Genesis is telling you about an event at an indefinite period before what follows it. So what does the Bible say about the age of the earth? Nothing, ladies and gentlemen, as far as I know. So I haven't the slightest difficulty in accepting the current estimate of, what is it, 13.7 or 13.8 billion years. The Bible says nothing about the age of the universe, and ironically, it doesn't depend on what you believe about the days. So that's the first thing. There's no necessary conflict. And people have thought about these things for ages. Now, I don't want to start going into an exposition of Genesis 1 because it would be disproportionate. May I do a bit of shameless advertising?
Sure.
Because I get this question so often, I've written a book about it called 7 Days That Divide the World. And if you want to take the risk of finding out more of what I believe, but I'm just going to tell you one little anecdote. And it's to do with a brilliant biologist who studied bioluminescence at this university and is a very distinguished scientific figure. And he came to me one day and he said, something utterly fascinating has happened. He said, I was giving a lecture on bioluminescence to a scientific group in London. And when I'd finished, a journalist said, you sound like Genesis. And he thought Genesis was a pop group. And he said, what do you mean I sound like Genesis? Well, they said you're talking about light, and it sounds like let there be light. He'd never read Genesis before, so he was fascinated by this. And he went out and he bought a Bible. And he started to read. And as he read, I'd never heard anything quite like this. He said, this let there be light, really, this is how he responded to it. How did they know all those centuries ago that light was so important? And he went on to write a book, which is available today, called The Genesis Enigma. Do you know what he says about Genesis 1? If ever I wanted evidence that a page of literature had been divinely inspired, I go to Genesis 1. He is not a believer. And this fascinated me. Now, that doesn't answer all these questions, but you mentioned evolution a couple of times. Now, this is a huge topic. I'm not a biologist, but I try to listen to the biologists. And as far as I can see, if you're simply talking about what Darwin observed, there's no controversy. I mean, just look at this all around this room. Why do we not look identical? We do look different, don't we? Well, that's because mutation and natural selection do something. That's clear. Darwin observed it in his Finch Speaks. I've even read the 1,000-page book by Wiener on the Finch Speaks just to get some grasp of them. But, okay, natural selection, mutation, and genetic drift and so on account for certain obvious variation. But now we run into difficulty. And it's not so much scientific difficulty. It's claims that turn out to be unjustified. What do I mean by that? There's a very famous book, you've all heard of it, The Blind Watchmaker by Richard Dawkins. And the central theme of it is, and it's very well written, the central theme of it is that the blind watchmaker, the automatic, etc., process that Darwin discovered is the explanation of the existence and variation of all of life. But it isn't. The first part of that sentence is false. And Dawkins has, and I grant him that, admitted it, but it took many years to admit it. Evolution has nothing to do with the origin of life as an explanation. Why? Because you've got to have life before evolution, whatever it does, can do anything. So the big mystery in biology is the origin of life, not the development of life, but they've got confused for years. So you need to separate those two out. And because I'm a mathematician, the origin of information and life is something that fascinates me. And we have virtually got nowhere. No one has any real idea about it. It's an open question. And I'm not going to go into any more answers to that. let me give you the bottom line, which is the important one for tonight. You see, it is common for people to deduce atheism from evolution. But how would you do that? Atheism is a worldview. Evolution is a biological theorem. They're not even in the same category philosophically. And I'm sure many of you know that when Darwin first expressed his theory, his main supporter in the United States, Asa Gray, was a Christian. And there are many theistic people today who accept, by and large, the neo-Darwinian synthesis, and they don't believe that it contradicts the existence of God for a very simple reason. The discovery of a mechanism that does something is not in itself an argument against a designer of that mechanism, even if the mechanism involves chance. On my arm, I have a self-winding watch. The random movements of my arm wind it up. Does that mean the watch wasn't designed? No, it actually has to have a more brilliant designer than one who designs a normal wind-up watch. Now, I, as a mathematician, since you asked me, I'm skeptical about certain aspects of evolutionary theory. I admit that to you, and I've written about it. I mustn't mention another book, but I have written about it. But my theism doesn't depend on it. God can do it any way he likes. How he actually did it is open for scientists to investigate. But what I'm noticing increasingly, that the kind of naive, I almost said, there I've said it, neo-Darwinian synthesis is beginning to be questioned by some very heavyweight biologists like Shapiro, who's the head of the Department of Biology in Chicago, who says, look, it hasn't come about by slight changes at all. And some people like Lynn Margulis, who was for a while at Oxford, say that neo-Darwinism is dead. And I'm at the stage now where, apart from my Christianity, I wouldn't quite know who to believe. So there are questions being asked in science, even though, by and large, most people have accepted an evolutionary hypothesis. My final point on this is very simple. Evolution is in a very special place scientifically, because it's the only theory I know of that you can deduce from worldview without a shred of evidence if you want to. And if you don't believe me and you read Latin, as I hope you all do, read Lucretius's book De Rerum Natura, on the nature of the physical universe. He was an atheist, an Epicurean, centuries ago, and he deduced everything Darwin did except for the transmutation of species, and he deduced it from atheism. The problem is, here's a theory that sits very close to a worldview, and it's very difficult to detect what is worldview-based and what is evidence-based. But that's a huge subject, and I'm taking a big risk in mentioning it, but then you want to be provoked.
Well, and just going through the questions here, actually, so many of them are to do with origins that I'm going to follow up on what you've just said about evolution and about the ultimate origins, with one of them which simply says Big Bang or God.
Well, Big Bang or God is simply a confusion, because Big Bang, what does Big Bang mean? Well, Fred Hoyle, who was one of my examiners, ferocious character that he was, Sir Fred Hoyle, he made a joke of it because he didn't like it. You and your Big Bang. He was a steady state man. And the irony of the Big Bang theory was that it was proposed by Georges Lemaitre, who was a Belgian Catholic priest. So it had a theological origin. But be that as it may, what is the Big Bang describing? It's now enshrined in the standard model of the universe, which was being discussed on the radio this morning by an astrophysicist who was saying we now know that space-time had a beginning. Even the multiverse apparently has a beginning, according to the mathematical theory. And so there's a beginning. Now, that is astonishing. Why astonishing? Well, you know I'm old. You know I was in Cambridge in the 60s. And it was then that the evidence for Lemaitre's thesis began to come in. The expansion of the universe due to the redshift of the galaxies, the microwave background, and various other things started to converge the thinking of astrophysicists that there was a beginning. It was resisted. And I remember reading the editorial in Nature, our most prestigious magazine in science, where I think it's Ian Maddox, Sir Ian Maddox, or Sir John Maddox, who was the editor, said, we cannot go down this route of thinking there was a beginning. Why? Because it'll give too much leverage to those who believe in creation. The arguably biggest scientific discovery of the 20th century was resisted by the top of the British scientific establishment because it paralleled Scripture. And you see, when I say in the beginning God created the universe, well, you can call that a Big Bang if you like. You're just saying you don't know what started it. I'm saying I do. But it's the same thing, that there was a beginning. And if you like, I'll tell you a little anecdote. I was at a conference at a very famous place where a number of physicists and philosophers and so on met. And in this conference, I risked making a statement about the Bible, and there was dead silence, and a very eminent physicist got up, and he said, Professor Lennox, please tell us you were joking when you said the Bible could possibly have any relevance to us in the 21st century. And I said, I wasn't joking. You could feel the tension in the room. I wasn't joking, I said. The Bible is an ancient document. In that technical sense, it's pre-scientific. But I said, isn't it interesting that it got the fact that there was a beginning right millennia before science caught up with it? And I said, what is more, I would dare to say to you that if instead of going along with Aristotle for as long as you did with his eternal universe and all the rest of it, and taken the biblical worldview more seriously, you might just have looked for evidence of a beginning before you did. So don't write it off. It is, of course, pre-scientific, but don't forget, the Bible is no scientific textbook, but when it talks about in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, it's talking about the same heavens and earth that physicists talk about. So a Christian like myself needn't be afraid of the word Big Bang. You can call it a Big Bang as you like, the standard model. It parallels exactly what Scripture has been saying for centuries.
Thank you very much. Change gear a little bit with this one. The top one on the list at the moment. What evidence is there for Christianity, the Christian God, over other religions?
How much time have we got?
You've probably got 3 or 4 minutes on that one.
Oh, dear. These are so impossible, but they're so important. Now, when we talk about other religions, there are dangers in doing that. Now, I started, and I'm glad I said it, that my parents taught me, and I've never had any cause to change my mind, that all people, whatever they believe, whatever their religion is, are of equal infinite value because they're made in the image of God. That's the first thing. The second thing is this, and it's very important. When you raise questions about other religions, you need to be very careful to distinguish between 2 aspects. The first one is the moral aspect. And the second one is the specific question of the basis of relationship with God in that specific religion. Now, the first question, you will find, and I remember reading C.S. Lewis's book, The Abolition of Man, many years ago. There's a fascinating appendix in it, which is slightly misleadingly named the Tao, where Lewis goes through, I can't remember how many, 40 or 50 different religions, right back to Roman pagan religion and everything else. And he discovered that in every one of them, they have the golden rule. Do unto others as you would they did to you. And he's making the point that there's a common base of morality right through all people, religious or not. And that is enormously important. In fact, society would completely collapse if that didn't exist. But that's another large topic. But now let's come to the specific question, because you asked me, I think, essentially, why I'm a Christian and not something else. And you might argue, well, it's because my parents were, and it's simply a genetic disease of the Irish. Well, you can take that view if you like. Now, in order to check that view, I've spent my whole life checking it, because I don't want to be fooled. And that is why, in week 1 at Cambridge, I deliberately went out of my way to befriend someone who did not share my worldview. When that person, after 2 years thinking, became a Christian, that showed me that people can change their worldview, and that was an important thing. The person was agnostic, skeptical, didn't really go anywhere, had no religious affiliation. But that was important for me. But the second thing is this: how can we answer such a question? And I'm not questioning people's sincerity at all, nor am I questioning their morality at all. I have friends in most religions whom I greatly respect. But when it comes to the specific question that you've asked me, why are you a Christian, not something else? My answer has to do with what Christianity offers me in terms of relationship with God. Now, in order to explain that briefly, we have to step back. What is a religion? And I've gone through this with many people from different cultures, and roughly summed up, most people tell me, even professing Christians tell me, that religion is like Oxford University. There's an entrance exam, at least there was when I went to Cambridge. And there's some ceremony that gets you in. And then you're on the way. And 3 years later, you face the final judgment. It's called finals. And you know, you might have the most delightful professors. And they're there to help you, and teach you, and supervise you. But they cannot guarantee you getting a first. They can't guarantee you getting anything. Why is that? Because the system is based on merit. You've got to pass that final exam. And the majority of people, when I talk to them, say, yes, my religion's like that. I get in some sort of ceremony performed on a child or an adult, and then we've got various people to teach us, priests, gurus, imams, all sorts. But they cannot guarantee that when I come to the final assessment, which will happen, that God will accept me. I've got to hope and try to behave as well as I can and eventually cast myself on the mercy of God. That's not Christianity. And this comes like a bombshell to many people. Christianity is not a merit-based system. If what I've just described is religion, then Christianity is not a religion. And I rarely use the word religion because it seems to smack of ceremonies, ritual, and all the rest of it. Christianity for me is a personal relationship with God through Christ. And the difference is, and it is a massive difference, that in religion, by and large, acceptance comes, you hope, at the end of the journey. In Christianity, it comes at the beginning. Because the entrance is not a ceremony, it is a step of commitment, rationally based on evidence. And what Christ promises, and you asked me the question, so I'll have to make it clear to you, is that if a person faces the mess they've made of their own lives and that of others and repents and trusts him for salvation, they receive in that moment peace with God. And Christ assures them that you'll never come into judgment but have passed from death to life. That is a huge difference. You see, as I sit here, I'm not doing this kind of an interview to gain brownie points. So God will say, well, Lennox isn't so bad, you know. He's made up for a few difficulties by doing this. No, 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 no. I do this not to gain acceptance, but because I've got it. Now, that's a vast difference. Dare I put it this way? Jesus Christ, at that level, competes with no other religion. Why? Because he offers me something none of the others do. And that is not the only reason I am a Christian, because that will sound to you very subjective. So let me make my final point. I have many Jewish friends and Muslim friends. And if you take the three great monotheistic religions, which all believe in Genesis and creation, then they all have views about Jesus. My Jewish friends believe that he died and did not rise. My Muslim friends believe he didn't die. I believe he both died and rose. They can't all three be correct. How do you answer the question? You have to get your hands dirty and investigate the evidence. So for me, the evidence, Rob, is at two levels. There's the actual working out the history and the logic. But then there is that thing that I just explained. There's the personal experience. That this business of forgiveness and knowing acceptance is something that I've experienced personally. Now, of course, you can rationalize and psychologize it away as much as you like. We can do that with any of our experiences. But when you put the subjective together with the objective, it seems to me there's a compelling case.
Thank you. A number of questions about, you mentioned there about the common basis of morality running through many religions, but about just mankind as a moral being. Could the concept, this is one of them, could the concept of good and evil be, we're back to evolution again, evolutionarily advantageous? It's not so much a question about evolution as it is about morality, and therefore explain morality.
Well, here we have our word explain again. And this, oddly enough, comes back to one of the positive things in David Hume that I applaud. The basic philosophical problem behind this question is, how do you get ought from is? And how do, taking the naturalistic worldview, that human beings are in the end the product of unguided natural processes, how does that produce morality? And there's a huge effort being made out there in the literature to try and get what David Hume said, to get ought from is. And he said he observed people would describe an is, some sort of phenomenon, maybe evolution or something like that. And they moved subtly from categories of is to ought. And I would want to argue, as many philosophers have argued, that you can't get ought from is. That oughtness, it looks to some psychologists at least, that oughtness is hardwired into our beings, as is language, but that's another huge area. So I just think you can't get there. You know, this idea of evolutionary advantage is, I find myself very skeptical. The ability to do abstract algebra doesn't give much of an evolutionary advantage as far as I can see. That there are so many things where human beings have capacities way beyond anything that can be remotely described as an evolutionary advantage. And if you say advantage, you have got already a measure in mind of what is better and what is worse. So you're talking in terms of progress. But you see, the pundits will tell me that evolution as they understand it, has no goal in mind whatsoever. There's no purpose. There's no trajectory. So I think that'll do on that.
Next question. Even if you can reconcile science and faith, why do we need God? Isn't science a satisfying companion to life?
Well, certainly not for me, it isn't. You know, that sounds marvelous, but the other question bears on this. Isn't science a satisfying companion for a young mother of 3 kids that has just been told she's got 3 months to live? And my answer to that is absolutely not. I think that is such a narrow kind of view. Science, you know, we should come back to the title. One of the leading things that got me thinking about these has to do with Oxford. You probably know, certainly the students do, that around this university there are buildings named after Sir Peter Medawar, a Nobel Prize winner. And he has written a book that every scientist should read. It's called The Limits of Science. And in it he says that science is limited, and you do it no service by saying it isn't limited. It's limited because it cannot answer the simple questions of a child. Where do I come from? Where am I going? What is the meaning of life? And Medawar adds to that. It is to philosophy, literature, religion that we must look for answers to these questions. Science, natural science, is successful because of the limited range of questions it asks. But it certainly doesn't deal with everything. And in any case, on your question, science is a companion. I feel it's utterly marvelous, but it doesn't deal with the big why questions of life at all. It's powerless to deal with them, as Medawar says. In fact, science doesn't even explain to me why science works. You see, in order to be a scientist, I must believe that science can be done. Why should I believe that? Well, it involves believing that the universe is mathematically intelligible. Why should I believe that? Why should I trust this mind? And I do believe in the mind, ladies and gentlemen, as distinct from the brain. You may not. Why should I believe this brain can understand, at least in part, the universe? Well, I would be hard-pushed to be a scientist if I was an atheist, because my atheist friends tell me that the brain is the end product of a mindless, unguided process. And I sometimes say to my scientist friends, and you trust it? And you know, I have put to many a leading scientist this question. Would you trust your computer if you knew it was the end product of a mindless, unguided process? And I've never had the answer yes to that. So there's a huge problem in justifying science, whereas the God answer to it, and this is what Newton believed, they felt science was worth doing because the universe out there, like the human mind in here, was a product of a rational creator, and therefore they could, in fact, worship God, they would put it, by doing their science. I've forgotten the question, so I may not be answering.
We've got 7 or 8 minutes left.
Okay.
A couple more questions, John. One about the future. What is the Christian view on artificial intelligence?
Well, how much time have you got, I say again? This is a hugely interesting question. I'm interested in this. I'm just writing a book on it at the moment. But I got a lovely letter from an 85-year-old scientist who's a pioneer of artificial intelligence. And he sent me one of his early papers from 1985, which is a wonderful title. And the title is "The Artificial in Artificial Intelligence is Real." So you need to work out what that means. But it is important. Why do I think it's important? Well, first of all, we're all benefiting from what's called narrow AI. And the steps in medicine are just phenomenal. The kind of thing I mean is AI, in its narrow sense, is, roughly speaking, deals with computers with huge databases that are able to look for patterns in those databases and predict certain things. For instance, photographs are taken, X-rays of 500,000 people and put in a database. And then a photograph of my lungs is taken. And within just a few seconds, my X-ray is compared with all of these, and all of these have been assessed by top-rating radiologists. And the accuracy of the diagnosis of my case is very often very much better than the very best radiologists. That's being used all over the place at the moment.
I need to hurry you up.
Yeah,
we're trying to get in one more question.
Well, the interesting thing for the Christian is not that, but it's the search for artificial general intelligence. That is the upgrading of humans to superintelligence. That is the idea in the book Homo Deus by Harari, which has these ideas that this century, the big agenda is going to be to maximize human happiness by re-engineering human beings, or else building life out of silicon. Now, I have a lot of questions about that, but there's something ironic about it, and that's the only point I'm going to make. People want to reach superintelligence and immortality, physical immortality. They forget that there is a human superintelligence in existence. His name is Jesus Christ. And he offers to those who trust him immortality, resurrection from the dead, a far vaster vista than is offered by the most advanced of AGI people. But if you want to know more about what I think of that, you'll have to wait for the book.
And our final question, I believe there's some talks next week, actually, you can hear about at the back regarding exactly some of these issues, and indeed this final question. Pascal said, the heart has its reasons for which the reason knows not. What would you say to someone who agrees with all that you have just said and yet is struggling to cross into belief?
Well, this is an experience that all of us know, and it's a very real experience. Some people find it difficult to propose marriage. I'm a mathematician. I like to know everything from the beginning, so it took me 7 years to get round to it. That there's a human uncertainty in commitment, and there's a sense in which that's wise. You don't commit yourself to such a huge thing without having evidence. And what I say to people is, the best way to proceed is to read and think about what the Bible actually says for yourself. Now, next week, interestingly enough, there's going to be a series of lectures by a very competent speaker, author, broadcaster, Tim Keller, who will be explaining in sequential steps what this is all about. And you only get this opportunity in Oxford every 3 years or so, and it's a wonderful thing to come along and expose yourself to Christian teaching, whether you believe in it or not. I often say to people, look, once in your life at least, listen to what is being said before you make up your mind. So often we make up our minds on the basis of no information. And so you have that opportunity next week. The commitment can be made when you're ready to make it. And you find it's a step into the light and into a certainty that you haven't had before. And of course, like so many things, you cannot experience it theoretically, because relationship with God through Christ is not relationship with a theory, it's relationship with a person. And if you're going to get to know me, I've got to give up the distance between you and me, and you've got to give up the distance between you and me. Skepticism means checking things out from a distance, and it's very wise. But if you want to get to know a person, there comes a point where you have to give up that distance. And that is a step that is very important.
And on that note, I think we have to end it. Thank you very much. Could you join me in thanking Dr. Lennox very much indeed?